say, the second thing is actually using the rebuttal or the responses, and the third is how do you execute it well. So let's first start with tracking. So, before that, what is response as a strategy? The first thing I'd like to clarify is that it's a combination of multiple skills. It isn't just mastering not true responses. It isn't just doing one thing. It's a lot of things all at once. So, for example, it includes adapting. It includes making things up on the spot because sometimes you don't have the time to write it all down. It includes listening and learning how to understand the opponent's arguments, etc. And that is all very important when you're talking about responses as a whole. The second thing is that I think you want to extend it beyond saying something isn't true. And that is because maybe for this lecture, I'll focus a bit more on not true responses. But essentially, as you become more advanced debaters, you realize that is something that is not always the strategy. So you'll want to, for example, use different responsive strategies, etc. And the last thing is it's adapting to what your opponent says. So even if it's something that only comes out on second speaker, it is just something that you want to adapt with along the way. So it might come at the speaker right before you, and you might have to just write the response very quickly. That is just an unfortunate problem of being a response speaker. Oftentimes, you're always on the back foot when it comes to responding to new things. Okay, so I first want to talk about tracking. In other words, it is just simply taking down notes on what is happening in the debate. Also, if you guys can turn on your cameras, I'd really appreciate it, just so it's a bit more engaging. Anyways, so tracking. So it's not complicated, and don't try to make it sound complicated. It is just your previous speaker, the speaker before you says this argument. You're basically just writing it down on your paper. And this is important, I think, particularly for latter speakers. So, for example, if you're a closing team, if you're a member or a whip, it's important for you to track the opening debate really well because that drastically changes the type of case that you're going to run. So why is tracking important? And it's not as straightforward as people say. And that is because one, if your tracking is wrong, it is most likely that your response is wrong. So you need to have a very good understanding of what the other side's case is in order to have a good response. But the second thing is that response is a very deliberate and precise form of attacking. So you're explaining why, for example, something is not true. So if you use vague wording, more often than not, your response will be vague. So the quality of your tracking oftentimes directly translates to the quality of the response that you will launch. Okay, so now I'll actually explain how that works. I think especially for beginner debating, don't overcomplicate it. The main point of tracking is that you see the main ideas. So you don't have to write everything down word per word. So here's an example. Let's say Prime Minister comes up there with this argument that it is hard to quit smoking. If I have to write it down on a paper, that's probably how I'd write it down. So for example, the premise of the Prime Minister is to explain why it is hard to quit smoking. They give two reasons why it's hard to quit smoking, and you can see it there. Reason number one is that cigarettes have addictive chemicals. And the second thing is that smoking is oftentimes a social activity, especially in Europe or especially in the West. And the conclusion of all this analysis and premise is that the state should give more incentives to help people quit. So if you notice, there are three parts to that argument, right? And if your coach gave you three different names for these parts, that's fine. Like you can use those names. If they, for example, I know some people use heal, so it's like handle, example, explanation, and link. Those are basically the same thing. So the handle is the premise, and the link is typically the conclusion. So use whatever term you're familiar with, but in general, it's all the same. So what is each part? The first part is a premise. So you're basically trying to take down note of what is your opponent trying to prove, right? So if you look at the argument up there, they're trying to prove that it is hard to quit smoking. So it's very simple. Premises are very straight to the point and they're very simple. On the analysis are reasons why the premise is true. So for example, what are the reasons that your opponent gives as to why smoking is very hard to quit? And the why does it matter to the ground or the motion? So this is typically the impacting. It can also be the weighing for some speakers, but in general, it's explaining why it is relevant to the ground or the motion. Okay, so those are the 3 parts of arguments. When you track, your notes should reflect those 3 parts. So you should be able to write down explicitly what the premise is. You're supposed to write down explicitly what the analysis is, and you're supposed to write down explicitly what the conclusion or what the impact is. Okay, again, if there are any questions, just let me know. All right, so what are tips on tracking? I think the first thing, hello? Am I not audible? Okay, I'm gonna switch earphones, so just give me a minute. I have actually 3 wired earphones, so let's see which one works the best. Hello, is this better? Is this clear? Hello? Okay. Okay, we can go back to like the last slide. Okay, so let's go with, or did you guys not hear anything? We can go back to the start again. So the first is tracking. So in other words, it's taking down notes on what is happening in the round, specifically what your opponent is saying. So for example, if you're in the opposition side, tracking is taking down notes of what the government is saying. What are the government's arguments? What is their analysis, etc. And this is important for 2 reasons. The first is that you cannot have a good response if you don't know what the other side is saying. So for example, if you do not understand what their argument is saying and you accidentally misrepresent it, that means that your response will also be inaccurate. So it has to be, having a good response stems from having a good understanding of what your opponent's case is. The second thing is that responding is a very deliberate and precise form of attack. So basically, I want you to think of it like this. The better your notes are, the better your tracking is, the better the response will be. So if your tracking is poor, then expect your response to be poor as well. So it's directly proportional to one another. So the better your responses is, the better your notes are, the better your tracking is, the better the response is. Okay, so let's go to the next part. So how do you track? So this part above is the top part of the slide is an example. So let's say that in a round, the Prime Minister gave an argument. The argument is that it is hard to quit smoking. They give 2 reasons why it's hard to quit smoking. The first is that cigarettes have addictive chemicals, and the second thing is that smoking, especially in a lot of Western countries, is a social activity. So people smoke together, it's kind of part of the culture. And then the conclusion that the argument they gave is that the state should give more incentives to help people quit. Okay, so if you notice, there's premise, there's the 2 reasons, and then there's the conclusion. Your coaches, if you have coaches, might have used different words. So for example, another term for premise is handle, another term for conclusion is impact. But regardless, they're all kind of the same thing. So first, let's talk about premise. What is the argument trying to prove? And I want to remind everyone that it's just one sentence. It's a very simple and straightforward sentence. So, and oftentimes it's actually the title of the argument. So you can try to use that to determine the premise. Don't overthink it. Typically, the premise is the simplest part of the argument. So if the premise is overcomplicated, either maybe you're overthinking it or the argument is inherently confusing. Second is the analysis. So the reasons why their premise is true. So if you go back to the example, they give 2 reasons why the premise is true, right? They first explain that there's addictive chemicals, and the second thing is that smoking is a social activity. So if you notice, the analysis is giving reasons why
the premise they have for the argument is something that is true or is accurate. And the last thing is the conclusion. So the last part of the argument, the one with the C. So this is how it ties back to the motion. So let's say the motion is about that the state should give people money to quit smoking. And that's the conclusion, right? That it's hard to quit smoking on your own. And that's why you need an extra reason to quit smoking, which could be through money. So the conclusion is explaining why the argument made, the premises and analysis made are things that are relevant to the motion. Okay, so this is just an outline. If you notice, right, it's not long at all, and it's very direct to the point. So when you're tracking, it needs to be very direct to the point, because again, these are your notes, right? If your tracking is unclear, then when you're reading back at your notes, you might also get confused because it is unclear. So you have to make sure that it is, one, accurate to the argument that was made, but secondly, as simple as you can make it. Okay, any questions on this? Okay, next. So tips with tracking. So the first thing I'd like to say is this doesn't have to be word for word transcription. Like, you don't have to say every single word that they said. And I actually think that it's bad if you do that, because that takes a lot of time and effort when it's not required. But make sure that your tracking has two things. The first thing is the broad strokes and the strategic direction of the argument. What do I mean by broad strokes and strategic direction of the argument? I'm going to go back to the previous slide. If you notice, the broad stroke is people have a hard time quitting smoking, and that's why the state, the government, should help them. So that's the strategy, and that's the broad stroke. Next is the skeleton of the argument and the logical flow. So skeleton basically means the outline of the argument. So what is the title of the argument? What is the first reason they gave for why it's true, etc., and etc. So you have to see the way that the speaker delivered the argument that has to be reflected in your tracking. The last thing is that use what works for you. So there are shortcuts to this. A good example is I actually use arrows. I use a curved arrow to indicate that something is wrong. So if there's a curved arrow, that means that I have a comment about the argument. If I use a straight arrow, it means, okay, this is the impact of the argument. So again, this is all just like arbitrary. Like you can decide for yourself what symbols you want to use. Key phrases as well you can use. So for example, I put EI. If I use EI, it means that it's an even if. If I put C, it means it's a conclusion. So things like that are good to follow, because they typically mean that it's easier for you to write down notes and you automatically understand it easier. Okay, this is it with tracking. Are there any questions with tracking? Okay, so we'll go to the next one now. There are 3 types of rebuttals that I want to talk about. The first thing is not true. The second thing is illogical. And the third thing is that not exclusive. So that we're going to go through them one by one, and then I'll have examples. So what is a not true rebuttal? Like what the name suggests, you are explaining why something is not true. So you are attacking the truthfulness of the claim. So you are saying that the claim that they have is factually incorrect. Typically, when you have a not true rebuttal, you attack the analysis. So you explain that, for example, the analysis they give are things that are not true, are things that are fallacious or inaccurate. The next thing is you need to assert a counter proposal to what the truth is. What does this mean in simple terms? You're saying that something is wrong. So when you're saying that something is wrong, you also need to explain what is right. So if you're saying that this claim is not true, then can you explain why this claim, what claim is actually correct or what claim is right? So here's an example. This argument is not true because it is outdated. Like this information was correct 5 years ago, but what is correct now, and then insert your reason. So if you want to explain why something is not true, by converse, you need to explain why something, what is correct, what is the truth. Okay, so here's an example. So to be clear, I'm gonna say the example and I want some participation. So if you can raise your hand and explain and give a not true rebuttal, that would be good. So here's the premise of the argument. The motion is this house would ban zoos, so you would close down all zoos. So the premise is zoos contribute to animal well-being. The speaker gives two reasons for why that's true. The first is zoos want to take care of animals because the audience wouldn't want to look at a malnourished or harmed animal. The second reason they give is that zoos are funded enough to take care of animals. So zoos have enough money to take care of animals. And then the conclusion is zoos are the best alternative for animals. Okay, would anyone like to volunteer to give an example of a not true response? Okay, I'll give you a hint. Focus on the analysis. So there are two pieces of analysis, right? The ones with the numbers. So number 1 and number 2. I want you to look at number 1 and number 2, and I want you to tell me, is there something incorrect, factually incorrect about either 1 or 2? Would anyone like to volunteer? Okay, I hope that you guys had enough time to think. Would anyone like to volunteer and explain what is not true?
Can we say that because animals, the best place that to suit these animals is forest, therefore zoos isn't necessarily the best place for them to accommodate.
So you're close. So you're attacking the conclusion. Try to attack the analysis. So you're talking about forests, right? So maybe you can explain, maybe try attacking the second layer. So you're almost there. The assumption is that zoos have enough money to take care of animals like they were in a forest, like they were in their natural habitat. Would you say that's true? Okay, so you say animals should be in the forest, right? Have you guys visited a zoo recently? Can you raise your hand if you visited a zoo
Many
recently?
years ago, though.
Okay, so when you last visited the zoo, would you say that the cage for lions or the cage for, let's say, monkeys didn't look like a forest?
Not really.
Yeah, so what can you derive from that? Do you think that zoos then have the money to take care of animals as if they were living in a forest, or would you say that that's untrue? Okay, how about this? You said yourself that the enclosures or the cages of animals don't look like the forest. They don't look like the natural habitat of an animal, right? Does that mean that the zoo has enough money to take care of animals?
Probably no.
Probably not. Right. So that's kind of the response, right? So if I had to give a not true rebuttal, that's what I'd say. But actually, the second reason is not true because a lot of zoos are actually underfunded and cannot take care of all their animals equally. And then you can, and if you want to give an explanation, you can say what you said. So when we go to zoos, It doesn't look like a forest. It actually is too small for animals. It doesn't have the habitat that animals need, etc. Because the zoo lacks money. Okay. Does anyone have any questions? I'm not sure about this. Okay, I'm gonna move to the next one. So next is illogical rebuttals. So you're attacking the logical flow of the argument. I want to be clear here. You're not attacking you're not attacking the factual nature. What does that mean? You're agreeing everything in the argument is factually true, but it does not lead to the conclusion. Okay, I'll say that again. You agree that the premise and the analysis is true, but that it doesn't lead to the conclusion. And that's why the target is the conclusion. I think it will be clear with this example. So the premise is that the sky is blue. We know that because one, we can see that the sky is blue. But secondly, we can see that I am wearing, not now, but then hypothetically, that I am wearing a blue shirt. And therefore the conclusion is I am the sky. Would anyone like to explain what is wrong with this? Would anyone like to see what's wrong with this?
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think like what is wrong with it is probably because the fact being the color blue is like a characteristic that can be applied to like many things. It's like if the object is the sky, then it's blue. But just because another object is blue as well doesn't mean it's the sky.
Yeah, so that's very good, right? So it is true that the sky is blue. It is true, hypothetically, that I'm wearing a blue shirt. But just because me and the sky are both blue does not mean that I am the sky. So even if each individual piece of analysis is correct, it does not logically lead to the conclusion. Okay, let me know if you have questions on this. And the last thing is not exclusive. So when you're explaining why something is not exclusive, you are attacking the comparative nature of the argument. What does that mean more concretely? Let's say the other side gives you a harm. Like, let's say the other side says, okay, if you do not ban guns, it harms people. So you explain why there's an equal harm on both sides. So you're basically explaining why anything the other side doesn't say, also everything the other side does say also exists under your side. That also extends to benefits. So let's say the other side is saying, oh, we have this benefit of world peace. So through the rebuttal, you can also say, actually, we also have the benefit of world peace. So the important thing here, right, is that you win debates because you are exclusive. So you win debates because you are you have an argument or you have a benefit that is true. But if it is not something that is exclusive to your side, it is technically value neutral. What does that mean? Because it is not exclusive to your side, it is not a reason why you should win the debate. Okay. So even if the argument isn't responded to per se, like it's still true, it's not something that you can win on because it equally exists on both sides. Okay. So I want to give a sample now. So let's give a sample. Let's say the motion is this house would ban guns. Guns kill people. That is the premise. There are two reasons they give. One is that it is easy to kill someone with a gun, so it's easy to just point the gun and shoot someone. And the second thing is that there's no way to stop a gun from being fired. So when a gun is shot, there's nothing you can do to protect someone. The conclusion is that guns are dangerous. Okay, I want to start this discussion with one thing. Are guns the only thing that can kill people?
No.
So what does that mean? Like if you were to make it your response, like complete the thought. So remember the rebuttal is not exclusive, right? So you're explaining why a harm exists on both sides. So if the other side says that guns can kill people, what is the not exclusive response? Would anyone like to try?
Many things can kill people, and many things are actually very dangerous.
That's correct. So that's true, right? And that's a reason why, even if the other side is correct, yes, guns kill people, it's not a benefit we can credit towards their side because it exists with multiple things. Okay, that's the type of rebuttals. The last part of this presentation is more on tips for the execution. So how do you run them properly? Is there a question first about the type of rebuttals? Okay, if you think of a question, just let me know. Just type it in the chat. All right. So there are three things, at least I have here, that make a good response. The first is efficiency. So if you spend, for example, 5 minutes delivering one response, that means that you're more or less taking too long, right? So you need to match the response with efficiency. So you have to say it as quickly as you can without compromising on its content. And the reason why this is such an important skill is because it also includes other skills like precision. So are you using the right word choice? Are you being as direct to the point as possible? Or are you just rambling and yapping? So efficiency is not just about the speed, okay? It's not just about the speed of your voice, but it also considers the words you are using and how you deliver your response. So how do you practice efficiency? So this is what I like to do. I listened to a speech. So whatever speech you can find online, give yourself 2 minutes to respond. So I will have a 2 minute timer. My response can only last for 2 minutes. And then, sorry, I do the 2 minutes. And then I gradually shorten the time. What does that mean? After the 2 minutes, I instead only give myself a minute and 30 seconds. After that, I only give myself a minute. After that, I only give myself 30 seconds. So I gradually shorten the time I give myself to respond to force myself to say it as efficiently as possible. Any questions on this? If it's too hard at first, you can obviously adjust it how you see fit. So let's say you give yourself instead of 4 minutes, and after the 4 minutes, you give yourself 3 minutes and 30 seconds, and then it goes lower and lower. So the good thing about this drill and this exercise is that you can easily adapt it to what your current skill level is, and then you kind of adjust it. For this particular skill, it's a lot of repetition because like after let's say the fourth time you've done this or after the fifth time you've done this, you will start to realize where you spend so much time on. So you spend, for example, so much time on explaining the argument said from the other speaker, and that's what eats up at your time. So the key here with this particular skill is that it should be repetitive. So you should try to do it as not as frequently as you can, but as consistently as you can. So maybe just doing a drill once every day is still a step in the right direction. Okay. Any questions before I go on to the next point? Okay, let's go to the next point. Sorry. The next point is proof. So like an argument, responses need to be proven. A good example is the example given by one of the people in this meeting, right? It was that just because something is blue does not automatically mean it is the sky, because being blue is just a characteristic. So when you give a response, you have to explain it like that, right? So you have to say, it is not true that I am the sky just because I'm wearing blue, because having the color blue is just a characteristic, and there is so much more required to be considered a sky. So things like that. So you have to explain it in that way because you need to prove it. You need to also explain why your response is true, which takes as much work and attention as an argument. So maybe let's go to a previous slide. Let's go to the not true side. Okay, here. Zoos contribute to animal well-being. So we responded to the second premise. Let's respond to the first one. For example, zoos want to take care of animals because the audience wouldn't like to look at a malnourished animal. You could say here, this is not true because, this is not true because a lot of, because the audiences don't really care about the state of the animal when they're visiting it. They typically go for entertainment purposes. And because of that, they don't really like look at the small details about how the animal is treated, etc. Because they are not the type of people to care about it, right? So the response is the first layer of this argument is untrue because the people that are likely to visit zoos are not the type of people to care about animal well-being in the first place, or just the people are unlikely to notice the state of the animal. So that's a sample. So if you notice, right, I still proved it. I still explained, hey, listen, the people that go to zoos are not the most politically active ones, are not the ones that care about animal welfare. And so that's what you can use as a response. How do you practice this? I think it's one of the harder ones to practice because it depends on the round, right? It depends on the argument because there are some responses that are harder to make than others because they're just more complicated. So the best thing you can do, I think, is just to hold yourself accountable. And the best way you can hold yourself accountable is to record your responses. For example, let's say you're doing a whip speech, you can record your whip speech and listen back on your responses. And then the main premise of this is that we want to see if your responses are genuinely assertive or are actually responding to it. So actually, it would be good also if you can use a round so you can reference back the previous speaker and see whether or not your response is something that actually responds to the claim, or your response is something that still needs more proof, still needs more explanation for it to work. Okay, any questions here? Okay, the last thing is the flow. So for the flow, this is more or less the structure of responses typically. So the first thing is, what are you responding to? So you can say, for example, I am responding to the first layer of the second argument. I'm responding to the premise of this argument. I am responding to the conclusion or the impacting of this argument. So just say in one line, what are you responding to? The second thing is, what response will you use? So you can say, I will prove why this is not true. I will prove why this is illogical. I will prove why this is not exclusive. So if you combine the two, it could be like, I am responding to the first argument I'm responding to the first argument of the previous speaker, and I will explain why it is not true. And then the last thing is explaining the response. So giving the proof, giving the explanation. How are you going to explain that it is illogical? How are you going to explain that it is not true? How do you practice this? I think for flow, especially when you're new, it seems super restrictive, and I get that. And I really hated it when I was learning the grade too. But I really think it's discipline and just trying to adhere to it. So what I'd say is try to formulate a response template that works for you. Use words that you are comfortable using, or words that you are comfortable saying, and then strictly apply it until it becomes second nature. So let's say you don't want to use my words. You don't want to say, I will explain, right? You can pick up other phrases or other words to use as well. Okay, any questions?